Hi, my name is Steve Romig, and I'm here to talk about MITRE ATT&CK, and we'll talk about what it is and what you can do with it, and hopefully I'll get you interested enough in it that you'll use some of the links that I have at the end of the talk to go find more information on your own. So with that, let's just dive into it. Well, I would dive into it. There we go. ATT&CK stands for Adversarial Tactics, Techniques, and Common Knowledge. It is a repository of information about our adversaries, intruders who would like to get into our systems or get our data, and we'd like to stop them. It'd be really good to know more about them so that we can mitigate and detect them. And to that end, MITRE created this attack framework that we'll be looking at to document all of these behaviors, which are commonly referred to as tactic, techniques, and procedures, or TTPs. You may have seen that acronym in various literature or in talks, and that's what it stands for, is TTP. And ATT&CK is basically a compendium of information about these TTPs. And we can use this to our advantage to both understand better what the intruders are trying to do, but also to map out our detections and mitigations and take steps to try to improve them. The ATT&CK website that we'll mostly be looking at today is attack.mitre.org, and we'll be looking at what the website looks like, but you can go there and take a look at it, maybe in parallel with what I'm doing here. So this is the landing page for the website. You can get to almost everything associated with MITRE ATT&CK from here pretty directly. That orange menu bar across the top has links that go to the various pieces that comprise this website. The one big exception to this is there is I don't know if I would call it a tool or a service that MITRE provides called ATT&CK Evaluations that is not as easy to find from here, but a simple Google search for MITRE ATT&CK Evaluations will find it. We'll talk more about that in a bit, and I do have a link for that at the end of the slide deck that you can use to find it easily. So I'm going to start with the matrices. If you're familiar at all with MITRE ATT&CK, you've probably seen these MITRE ATT&CK matrices, and you're probably most familiar, or the one that gets shown the most familiar, is the enterprise matrix, which looks like this. I'm going for a very, I've only got about half an hour to talk here, and I'm going to go for a very high-level overview of all this. We're not going to dive into the details of what's in the matrix. There's a number of different matrices that are available. This is the enterprise matrix. This shows the tactics and techniques that are associated with, I guess, what they would call enterprise operating systems like Windows, Linux, Mac OS, but also IaaS cloud services like AWS or Google Cloud Platform or Azure. They also have matrices for what's called pre-attack, which are the things that intruders do before they actually get around to attacking you, which would be doing basic reconnaissance, looking up web pages, maybe looking at your directory information if you've got directory information published. Just the things that they would do to try to kind of size you up and figure out what your points of entry might be or what your weak spots might be. That's all in the pre-attack matrix. They also have a matrix for mobile devices, which covers Android and iOS, and they have a matrix for industrial control systems. So lots and lots of different matrices that are available, but we're going to focus on the enterprise matrix. If you look at this matrix, it looks quite complicated, but it's really pretty straightforward. Across the different columns here are the tactics. So you could think of the tactics as being the goals that or maybe the sub-goals that the attacker is trying to achieve in order to reach his final goal. Maybe their final goal is to exfiltrate sensitive data from your organization. But in order to do that, they've got to go through a number of different sub-goals, like gaining initial access, which is this technique on the far left, or maintaining persistence on the system, which is the third column. So each of these columns represents a general kind of sub-goal or a tactic that the intruder might take advantage of. I would say, generally speaking, they're going to progress left to right, but that's not necessarily the case. Oftentimes, as they gain access to or further access within your system, they'll need to go back to, what you might think of as previous steps. For instance, they got onto a new system and now they want to maintain persistence on that new system. They'll have to go back to the persistence column and, work from there. So there's a lot of back and forth. It's not necessarily a linear progression from left to right. The columns each represent a tactic, and underneath each tactic is a list of one or more techniques. Techniques can belong to multiple tactics. For instance, setting up a scheduled task can be used for maintaining persistence. It can be used for privilege escalation, and I think at least another couple of different tactics. So the techniques are not limited to a single tactic. But anyway, you've got a list of techniques, a list of tactics, and let's dive into some of this. One way of, I talked about how an intruder gets into your system. Let's visualize that, I guess, just briefly. An attack might start with something like a phishing attack, which is the mechanism that they use to gain access to compromised accounts. People will give up their passwords, they get access to the accounts, and then maybe they use that to get into your system somehow and maintain persistence through a scheduled task. Maybe they came in through a remote desktop connection, which now that I think about it, probably ought to be another link here in the chain for how they actually gained access through remote desktop with a account that they got through phishing. But anyway, ignore that little detail. They got in and maintained persistence through setting up a scheduled task, and then decided to dump credentials from the operating system using commonly available tools like maybe cats or something. And those credentials gave them access to remote services on other computers, which allowed them to transfer laterally from one system to another. And once they got into another system, maybe they had to jump back and maintain persistence, but this time they did it through modifying the boot initialization scripts, which is another persistence technique. And once they gained persistence on that system, maybe they looked around on the local file system and found some interesting data and exfiltrated over web services, maybe to something like a Pastebin or an Amazon S3 bucket or something. So that's how a typical attack might go, and this is how you would visualize it or map it against the MITRE framework. The specific details here aren't important. I guess the main things I want you to get out of this are that the different techniques represent the specific behaviors or the specific things that an intruder might do on your system. We might not know what all of their activities are. They're like I mentioned, they must have gotten in somehow using a compromised account, but I don't have that listed here, and maybe we don't know how they got in, whether it was through remote desktop or some other remote service. Maybe we don't know that or haven't discovered that yet. But the things that you do know, you can map to the MITRE ATT&CK framework and build up a kind of a picture or a detailed description of exactly what the intruders did. And these details are really, really useful for understanding attacks, and especially for planning out how to defend ourselves against those attacks or detect those attacks. So I want to dive into the enterprise matrix in a little bit more detail. If you go back to the main website and click on the matrices and go to the enterprise matrix, you see a view like this. If you hover over the tactics, it will show you the tactic ID, and the same thing for the techniques. And if you click on a tactic, you'll get a very nice description of what that tactic is all about. So it starts with a general description of what the tactic is, and then it lists all of the different techniques under it. And this table shows the technique IDs, the names, and a description for each technique. But you can see that there are links here, and so we could actually click on these links for the individual techniques by name or by ID and get even more details, which we'll see in a minute here. If we hover over the techniques, similarly, we'll see the technique ID. These IDs are really useful. Having worked a little bit with MITRE ATT&CK, I find it very helpful to have the techniques, even though, knowing that drive-by compromise is T1189 is not all that terribly helpful and not very easy to remember. Having that like in a document that describes an attack and refers it back to initial access through a drive-by compromise, and then in parentheses or something like that saying that it's T1189 is really helpful, because sometimes over time, the names of the techniques and the tactics have changed a little bit, but those IDs are fairly persistent. And so knowing the ID is very helpful. If you click on a technique, you'll see details about that technique, which includes a general description of the technique. Over on the right, you see a box that includes a little more, I guess, kind of high-level overview information, which includes things, what platform this technique applies to, whether there are sub-techniques for this technique. That's one thing I guess I hadn't mentioned yet, is that techniques can have sub-techniques, which makes things a little more complicated. If we go back and look at the matrix, these pieces that have a little, I don't know what you would call it, but a little doohickey off to the right can be clicked on to show the sub-techniques. I don't think I have a slide that shows that, unfortunately, but I'll let you explore that on your own. Sub-techniques are just a way of getting yet more information crammed into the general matrix without making it look too overloaded if you just want to get a high-level view. At any rate, back to the box here, we've also got information about the data sources that you might use in detecting this particular technique. That can give you a lot of really good ideas about, do I have this data source or any of these data sources? Have I built something using that data source that actually detects this technique? We've got a list of contributors. There's a version number for the technique, information about when it was created and when it was modified. If we keep scrolling through this description, we'll see a list of procedural examples. This is a list of the different threat actor groups that have been observed using this technique and a description of how they use the technique. And you can see these all have cross-references on them, and there's a list of references at the end of this description. MITRE is huge on documentation, and so almost everything in here is going to have cross-references to additional information. We'll talk a little bit more about the uses of the MITRE ATT&CK framework in a minute, but one of the biggest uses for this is just that it's a fabulous motherlode of data about tactics, techniques, and procedures that intruders use. And if you're interested in finding out more about any of those things, this is one of the first places I would go to find out information. And also about things like threat actors and the software that they use. We'll see more examples of that in a minute. So anyway, list of procedures. Description of the different mitigations that you might put in place to protect your systems from the use of this kind of a technique. There are techniques that you may not be able to put mitigations in place of. For instance, anything using legitimate access using a compromised account, you probably don't want to block that because you might be blocking legitimate users from using that service. But there's certainly things that you may be able to employ against other techniques to stop or at least detect that technique. And speaking of detection, there's a description here about how you could go about implementing detections for this technique. And then finally, a list of references. Lots and lots of references. So if we go back to the main homepage here, I want to explore the rest of the menu bar across the top. Tactics gives you a list of all of the tactics that are available for the matrix that you're looking at. So in this case, we're looking at the enterprise matrix. So we see a list of the enterprise tactics. You can click on those and see the same details about those tactics. Techniques gives us a list of all the techniques, and we can filter that on the left to specific tactics. But the main display here is going to show us all of the techniques. And you can see for this first technique here, which is a abuse elevation control mechanism, there's a number of things listed under that. There's a .001, a .002, a .003. Those are sub-techniques. And so, for instance, the first example there, .001, is about using set UID and set group ID programs or shell scripts on Unix systems. Mitigations gives you a list of the different mitigations. So just like we had talked about the tactics and techniques being documented, the different mitigations that are listed under the MITRE ATT&CK framework for the different techniques also have their own entries with details about those mitigations. For instance, if we look at the Active Directory configuration mitigation, we can see the list of techniques that are addressed by the mitigation. So this shows the domain. This mitigation may apply against multiple domains, like the pre-attack matrix or the enterprise matrix. It'll give you the ID for the technique, the sub-technique number, if there is one, the name of that technique or sub-technique, and then a description of what that description of what that mitigation is and how it applies to that technique. Back on the menu bar, the groups entry will give us a list of all of the different threat actor groups. This is certainly not an exhaustive list of all the different threat actors that are out there, but it is a detailed list. And there's a lot of really good information here. For instance, later in the talk here, I'll show you an example of mapping out the techniques used by Iranian threat actors. And I did that by going to this list of groups and searching for just the word Iran, and getting a list of all of those threat actors and mapping them on the MITRE ATT&CK framework using Attack Navigator. For instance, if we click on one of these groups, here I've clicked on APT-C36, which says it's a suspected South American espionage group that has been active since 2018. And that's not particularly interesting to me, but might be interesting to somebody. And it has a list of the associated groups. So it references a group called Blind Eagle. And there are a list of the techniques that they have been observed to use. So you would see cross-references between the techniques and the groups that use those techniques, and the groups and the techniques and the software that they use. Speaking of software, if you click on that back in the main menu, you'll get a list of all the software that MITRE ATT&CK has documented. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. This indicates that there's about 477 different software packages documented as part of MITRE ATT&CK. So, if there's some new piece of malware or something like that, it might not be here. But a lot of the really common stuff, and especially I would say the relatively older stuff, is in here. I don't know how long it takes before something shows up in here, or how prevalent it has to be before it shows up. But this does get updated. And it's an interesting place to look to see if you're curious about a piece of malware and there's an entry here, you can learn more about it. And specifically, you can learn more about the techniques that software uses. So for instance, if we look at the first entry there, 3-para-rat, which is a remote access Trojan, we'll see some information about the techniques that it uses. It looks like that entry was created back in 2017, but it was last modified in March of 2020. So these pieces of information are being updated. The other thing I want to call your attention to on the right toward the middle there is a kind of a dark box that says Attack Navigator Layers. This will take you to a tool called Attack Navigator, which we haven't really talked about yet, but it is a web service that basically provides an interactive version of the different matrices. And you can go in and interact with it and assign comments, colors, scores to the different techniques. You can export the data. You can combine layers together in different ways. And I'll show you some things that were produced using Attack Navigator here shortly. But anyway, the description for the software has a list of the techniques, and it's pretty interesting stuff. So MITRE ATT&CK can be used for a lot of things. And this certainly is not an exhaustive list, or it's not intended to be an exhaustive list. I think it's really up to your imagination what you might do with this. First and foremost, it's a great information source. If you're interested in learning more about a particular group or software or the tactics or techniques in the things that you're reading, research them using MITRE ATT&CK. There's certainly other resources that you might take advantage of, and I certainly wouldn't want to downplay the advantage of just going out and doing a general Google search, but this is certainly a good place to go if you're interested in learning about the sorts of things that are documented here. And I love the fact that they have links to other references. So if you're interested in learning about a particular technique that you're not familiar with, you see it referenced in an article someplace that you're reading about, you can look it up here. Read all about the description and the techniques, the mitigations and the defenses, and then look at the references to find more information if you're interested in that. It's a great place to go. Adversarial emulation, I keep wanting to say adversary elimination, which is kind of funny, but not, it might be nice if we could do adversary elimination, but adversary emulation is the idea that if we understand what the adversaries are doing and how they do it, if we can get as specific as looking at the techniques that they're using and maybe even the procedures that they use, then we can emulate those same behaviors to test our existing defenses and detections in a realistic way. This is a really great idea that's been gaining popularity, and we'll see this come up again and again, certainly in the future, but this is going to come up again and again in the other uses that we're talking about here. Among other things, this can really help us with our red team engagements, our penetration testing engagements, because they can do a more accurate job doing realistic engagements to test your defenses. But this also helps with our purple team engagements. Purple teaming is the idea that the red team, the penetration testing team, or if you think of it, the attacking team, and the blue team, the defense team, the incident response team, and work together to try to test certain specific aspects of your defenses and work toward improving those defenses. Maybe it's, we discover that we don't have a data source, and so we need to develop a data source to give us visibility. Or maybe we discover that there's a data source, but we're not using the data source at all, or maybe not correctly to detect activity, or maybe we have a mitigation in place that isn't working correctly. The red team tests these things to see what doesn't work, and the blue team works with what they have visibility into to try to detect and stop the red team. And the overall work of all of this is to improve your defenses. But MITRE ATT&CK can facilitate this because, again, we can emulate adversarial behaviors and use this to both prioritize our work, but also to just do more realistic testing. We can also try to map our coverage of the different techniques. Now, you're never going to get to a point, I don't think, maybe somebody has reached this utopian state, but I don't think you ever get to a point where you're covering everything 100%. And, because of that, you need to, I guess, look at what you are covering and how well you're covering it. So there's an aspect of just plain yes, no, do we have some kind of mitigation or detection in place for this technique? The ones where we don't have something in place, or maybe things that we should be focusing on developing, if those techniques are of interest to us or are a threat to us. But we might also want to use this to try to evaluate the maturity of our different defenses, maybe partly through purple team engagements or through just other forms of testing. And once we've gone that far, we can do a defensive gap analysis where we compare our coverage, whether we're measuring that objectively or subjectively, and whether we're looking at the mitigations that we have in place or detections or both. And we can compare that against the techniques that are used by threats, the groups or the malware categories like ransomware that we're most concerned about. And I'll show you, I guess, a visualization of what that might look like here in a minute. We can use this to prioritize our efforts. We can't mitigate 100% of everything, so what should we focus on? Well, maybe if we had a better understanding of the threat actors that we're concerned about, or if we have a better understanding of general concerns like ransomware, maybe those things focus on certain techniques, and we can focus on mitigating those techniques if those are the threats that we're worried about the most. And then finally, product evaluations. Companies are increasingly using MITRE ATT&CK to describe what their products do, and we can use this to compare products or evaluate how they fit with the various weaknesses that we have in our coverage, or see where they overlap with our existing coverage. And MITRE is actually using this to produce product evaluations, which we'll talk about here in a bit. So this doesn't really fit into the uses, I guess, but one use is just in general documentation. If you're reading things on the interwebs, you may find articles that reference different MITRE ATT&CK techniques. Some of these are quite detailed. For instance, this is a report from Sophos about, I think it's Maze ransomware, and I just took a screenshot of a portion of the report that basically walks through the specific techniques that this ransomware sample is known to use. And so you can see that they list out the different tactics, initial access, execution, defense evasion, and so on. And under each, they have the specific techniques that this Maze ransomware has been observed to take advantage of. And you can take this and map this back against that matrix. And we'll actually do that here in a minute. And that can give you some insights about how ransomware works and how you might go about mitigating it or detecting it. Sometimes you'll just find charts that visualize the MITRE attack techniques without giving out specific details like the technique IDs. This is another Sophos report also for ransomware. In this case, it's NetWalker, and it just shows something that's like an edited down or a filtered version of the enterprise matrix, showing just the tactics and techniques that apply to this particular type of ransomware. And some of these are mentioning specific techniques, and some of these are mentioning details more at the procedural level. And I think these are very easy to understand visually, but they're a little frustrating to me because they don't have the technique IDs. And if you're trying to do something like map this back to the specific techniques in the MITRE ATT&CK framework, you're going to have some struggles. But still, this is fairly common, and it's not without its uses. So I want to do some just exploration of different ways of using the MITRE ATT&CK framework to visualize some things. And I want to start with ransomware threats. So it's a huge threat. The basic idea is that if we can look for analyses of ransomware that map things back to MITRE ATT&CK techniques like we just saw, we can use Attack Navigator to create depictions of this. And I'm doing this by adding scores to the different techniques. And those scores are used to assign colors. It just does that automatically. And as we add the different layers together, the things with higher scores will be the techniques that are more common amongst the different samples of malware that we're looking at or ransomware that we're looking at. And the higher scores will be greener and the lower scores will be red. So we're going to start here with just one malware sample. This is Maze 1. And what the successive slides I'm going to show here are adding additional techniques for other examples of malware. So it'll make more sense, I guess, when I do it. Here I've added Maze 2, and you can see some additional techniques have been added here. And some have turned from red to orange, which means that they're common between those two different samples of ransomware. This is adding Maze 3. Same thing. I'm just adding additional techniques and bumping up the scores for the common ones. This adds an analysis of NetWalker. So again, more techniques. You can see that there's some things that are starting to tinge a little bit yellow or yellowish orange, pumpkin. This is adding ProLock, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce these two, Revel and Ryuk. I guess I did try to pronounce it, but Revel and Ryuk. Twofer. This is adding Robin Hood. So we've got some green on here now. RSA had published an analysis of a whole bunch of ransomware, so I just went ahead and threw that in there because they did a really nice job of mapping it to specific technique IDs, which made my work easy. And I didn't want to ignore them because it was a very nice detailed analysis. This is adding Sodinokibi. And finally, WannaCry. And RSA had also done an analysis of a new category of ransomware-like things called wiperware, where the intent is to extort you for money in exchange for not deleting your files. So instead of encrypting, they delete. And the end result here is that we see that there's a bunch of techniques that are green, which are the things that are common amongst all the different samples of ransomware that were analyzed. So we see, for instance, under the impact column to the right, data encrypted for impact is green. No big surprise there. Under collection, we've got data from local system. And, various other things are green here. And those might be the techniques that we want to focus on the most if we don't have anything in place to cover those, because those are the things that are most common between the different ransomware samples. want to show you another example from a different domain. There was some concern at the beginning of this calendar year, I think, about Iranian threat actors. I don't remember exactly what had happened, but there was a big political dust-up. And then, as I remember correctly, Iranian computer security groups were trying to get in and break in various places, and a lot of concern about that. It was a little bit of a flash in the pan because I don't remember anybody worrying about it after a couple of weeks. But I did an analysis of different Iranian threat actors using the data from MITRE ATT&CK. So this is just successive slides that show the techniques used by different Iranian groups like APT-33, 39, Charming Kitten, Copy Kitten. I'm horribly sorry about the siren in the back, if you can hear that. Group 5, Leaf Miner, Muddy Waters, Oil Rig, and combining them all together, we see a different kind of frequency map than what we saw for the ransomware. I guess the big thing that highlights to me is that under execution, the greenest thing on the map is the command and scripting interpreter technique. And so that might be our main focus if we want to try to detect Iranian threat actors. And of course, you could do things like combining the ransomware analysis with the Iranian analysis. I did a similar thing with COVID-19 threat actors and came up with this map. So they all look a little bit different, but it's the same idea. We're just basically looking at what the common techniques are. You could imagine going through and doing a deeper analysis of all of the different threats that we face over some, period of time, and mapping these all together in a kind of a master frequency map to try to figure out what the biggest concerns should be. And then we can do things like gap analysis. We can compare this against our current defenses. So this first slide here is showing the mitigations that we have in place using existing tools for endpoint protection. And this was just kind of a manual effort by our endpoint protection team looking at things like application security and email security and data loss prevention and semantic endpoint protection. And they took their best stab at identifying which techniques were covered by those. They had actually weighted them with different weights depending upon how well they thought they did. I'm just being optimistic here and calling them all 100 totally solved for green. And in the next slide, I've got our familiar slide of all the ransomware and wiperware techniques, but I've made everything red. So this is not a frequency map. This is a list of all the techniques used by ransomware. And we can combine those together. So this one shows our endpoint protection tools and the techniques that they solve for, mapped against the techniques that ransomware uses. And what I've done here is anything that was green in the endpoint protection side, I just left green, and anything that wasn't green that was red, I left red. So anything that's red on this map are the techniques used by ransomware that we do not have an endpoint protection solution for directly. Now, some of this may be, for instance, phishing, shows up red here. So I must have missed something because Proofpoint, our email security solution, actually does quite a nice job with phishing. But anyway, you get the idea here. I wish I had noticed that in the other umpteen times that I practiced this talk, because maybe I could have fixed the slide. Finally, I know that I'm going a little overtime here, but I wanted to talk about MITRE's product evaluations. They are starting to do these product evaluations, and the idea here is that they have a standard methodology that they follow, and they come up with a adversary-based emulation that they use for a kind of a cohort of products each year. I think they do this annually. And so you can read the methodology. This is their methodology here. I'm not going to go into the details here, but they basically talk about exactly how they go about devising the scenario and applying the scenario on the different products. You can see a description of the scenario that they came up with. This year, they're modeling it on a threat group called APT-29. And they've got a description of what it is. They have some notes about the emulation. They show a list of the participants for this year, so you can see companies like Bitdefender and CrowdStrike and Elastic and Kaspersky. I mean, all the familiar names and some names that I'm not familiar with participated in this. And it's not really a competition to pit the products against each other so much as it is just a chance for each product to demonstrate how well it does against this scenario. And they provide various results that help you to understand what the product did in terms of detecting or stopping the particular techniques used in their emulated scenario. I'm not going to go into details here, but the attack evaluations are very illuminating, especially once you understand exactly how they're going about doing it. It's pretty interesting stuff. So some references. I'm not going to go through these, I guess, in detail, just mentioning. We've got a link to the main MITRE ATT&CK website. If you're interested in reading and you want to read more about MITRE ATT&CK, there's a paper there under their references called MITRE ATT&CK Design and Philosophy that I found extremely helpful. I wish I had read it earlier. It was a very illuminating paper. MITRE has a bunch of related projects. I've mentioned Attack Navigator several times. That's been extremely helpful. I use that in creating all of those, like the ransomware and the Iranian threat actor in the gap analysis pictures were all created using Attack Navigator. It's a fantastic tool. But they've got some other tools that are available on GitHub and also some things that are documented on their website. Attack evaluations is extremely helpful for product evaluations. And the link for that is there. If you just do a Google search for MITRE ATT&CK evaluations, you'll find it easily enough, but there's the link. And MITRE has recently added MITRE Shield, which is the same sort of idea of having a matrix way of analyzing things, but this is looking more on the detection side of things. And so that is also worth looking at. That was it for my talk. I hope you found it interesting. I don't know quite how we're handling questions, but hopefully we'll have questions, opportunity for answering questions. So with that, I will say goodbye.